Today's occurrence happens in Wellington, Washington. On Monday, February 21st, 1910, in Everett, Washington, 30 miles north of Seattle, District Weather Observer G.N. Salisbury delivered the news that it was going to snow again. There would be another record-breaking low-temperature snowstorm, and it was expected to bring heavy precipitation to the entire Pacific Northwest. 37-year-old James Henry O'Neill was superintendent of the Great Railway Cascade Division. He was responsible for keeping mail, freight, and passenger trains moving for the entire western half of Washington state, several hundred miles of railways. He had this position for the past 3 years and knew the smallest storm turned into a huge crisis. He was off the day before and supposed to be home with his wife and baby, but a foot of snow falling on the mountains east of them overwhelmed his track-clearing snowplows and delayed 2 of his most important trains at the station in Skycomish. Just today, there was another train stranded in Mason's Creek with a broken-down locomotive. This part of the railway was so exhausting because all the mainline Great Northern trains entering or leaving the Puget Sound region had to go through the Cascade Mountains. The mountains are 40 miles east of Seattle and form a huge wall that divides the Pacific Northwest from north to south. They caused constant undesirable weather for anyone west of the mountain. For 7 months of the year, O'Neill had to deal with floods, mudslides, blizzards, and avalanches. And these past few years had been increasingly worse. But this year in particular was absolutely brutal because even Seattle was being hit with record-breaking weather. Starting last year, mudslides had caused all kinds of issues with the railway, and in January and February, the snowslides felt nonstop. The trains being sent to help the trains trapped from the slides were being hit themselves. The Cascade region is one of the snowiest regions in the U.S., but also in the world. That's why the Great Northern Railway was so important. Keeping them open and on schedule was vital to the Americans in Washington being connected to the rest of the country. So much so that the Great Northern had spent millions beyond their original construction to create tall wooden snow sheds over the track in areas prone to snowslides. That morning, General Manager for the Great Northern Railways announced $2.5 million going towards a new project that would clean and grade a 500-foot wide strip of land on the western slope of the mountain. The idea was for it to be too wide for mud and snowslides to affect the rails in the area, because that area was most prone to it. Now, for the past 3 winters, James O'Neill and his men had a reputation for being able to handle snowfall in the area, keeping the lines open and having no passenger fatalities at all, which was unheard of at the time because at this point in history, there were record numbers of railway accidents. He even managed to keep things moving even with an ongoing strike that started back in November. It was with the railway switchmen, the guys that reshuffled and assembled trains in the rail yard. Now, while James was stationed in Everett, he knew that with the oncoming storm, he would have to go into the field because telephones and telegraphs were likely to go down. To have the best chance at keeping everything moving and being able to communicate with the other parties involved, he would need to go to the area most likely to have problems. That place was Stevens Pass, where the Cascade Tunnel was located, the Great Northern's only path through the Cascade Mountains summit ridge. This meant that he would be leaving his newly pregnant wife, Bernice, alone for at least several days. And with telegraphs asking for help before the storm was even there yet, already pouring into his office, he knew he didn't have a choice. He got his portable office and sleeping quarters named BA-16 and arranged for it to be attached to an eastbound Great Northern train number 4 the next day. His stenographer and portable office steward would go with him as far as Wellington, a small station at the west end of the Cascade Tunnel. On the way, O'Neill arranged for a few high-up and experienced workers to be stationed and ready when needed. But what O'Neill didn't know was that the storm headed his way would be the cause of the worst avalanche disaster in U.S. history, killing 96 people and injuring countless others in the very trains he presided over. I'm Tatiana Bunch, and this is the story of the Wellington Avalanche train disaster. Before I get too far into it, most of what I'm going to be talking about today comes from the book based on this event by Gary Christ, and it's called The White Cascade. Everything will be linked at occurrencepod.com if you want to check it out. And just like with other episodes I've done, this one has a lot of people involved. Many of them have similar or the same first names, so I'm going to be sticking mostly to the last names. And without further ado, just after 7 p.m. on Tuesday, February 22nd, 1910, in Spokane, Washington, Louis Jessup boarded train number 25, also known as the Seattle Express. There were light snow flurries falling in the station. He boarded one of the two train's newly remodeled heated sleeper cars. There were gentlemen's and ladies' lounges at each end of the sleepers, and they were very nice. The inside had polished mahogany and plush seating. The Seattle Express was pulling 2-day coaches, a mail car, a baggage car, and an observation car where men could discuss business, smoke, and drink without having to worry about offending women with their activities. Jessup was a 32-year-old lawyer and boarded at the Hammermills Island Rail Station. A few months ago, he lost a case in the Superior Court of Stevens County, Colville, just north of Spokane, where he lived and practiced. He was on his way to appeal the case to the Washington State Supreme Court in Olympia, and he could have just filed his brief on paper, but he decided to argue it in person in front of the judges. Jessup was a former city attorney, so he was determined to use his skills to get the court to reverse the lower court's decision. He gave himself 36 hours to get from Spokane to Seattle to Olympia. The journey was less than 400 miles, but he planned his trip as meticulously as he was known to plan his court cases. So even if there were major delays with his train, there would be plenty of time to make his connections, enjoy a nice dinner in the capital, and telegraph his wife, Flora. His hearing wasn't even until Thursday, and he loved that he would have enough time to do all of that and still get a good night's rest before court. Jessup had plenty of time to rehearse what he would say several times during the trip too, which was a good thing because this was a major case for him. Now, 50-year-old John Merritt got onto the train too, and he was the opposing lawyer to Jessup. When Merritt heard Jessup was arguing the case in person, he booked a ticket too. They were old friends in a opposing lawyer way, I guess, but it was a complete coincidence that they were on the same train. At 7:30 p.m., the Seattle Express left the Spokane station on schedule. Spokane had over 104,000 people living there and was growing rapidly with a 15-story skyscraper already developed. Leaving the Spokane station, there were about 55 passengers on board, including men, women, and children. There were 3 other attorneys on board, 2 real estate men, an electrician, a civil engineer, a clergyman, and 3 or 4 drummers in the mix too. James O'Neill had been in Wellington for roughly 12 hours as it neared midnight. Earlier, around 9 p.m., it started to snow, with various wind strengths in different areas of his division. During the hours between 9 p.m. and midnight, there had been some small problems and a significant delay on the west slope, but things were at least still running. When he left his wife and kid that morning, it was cold, but by the time he reached the scenic hot spring station on the west slope, it was only 10 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 12 degrees Celsius. Cold weather was notorious for causing problems for stop trains. An extra long westbound train got stuck overnight. Trying to pull it free caused the train to break in two, with its second half staying on the main line. This, of course, blocked trains trying to use the main line in both directions, specifically 3 first-class trains. So O'Neill and one of his train masters, Arthur Blackburn, gathered 75 to 100 shovelers to keep the train undercarriage snow-free. Then O'Neill had a spare engine get to the damaged freight car, reconnect the split train, and pull it off the main track. The delay lasted a few hours, but things got moving again all right. O'Neill left Blackburn in charge at the scenic station and took his business car uphill towards Wellington. By the time O'Neill made it inside of the Wellington station telegraph office, it was just past noon. And with each train that went through the station, O'Neill made sure to ask every single conductor and engineer about the weather conditions and their opinions on how things were going. His main focus was on the rotary snowplows. They were state-of-the-art, reinforced rail cars with a rotating blade wheel attached to the front and 1 or 2 trailing locomotives attached to the back. They could only move like 10 miles an hour, but could cut through drifts up to 13 feet tall, and 6 of them could keep the entire division's tracks free of snow and keep the trains moving. But only 4 of the 5 were currently in the field for him. An order was given for all first-class trains carrying passengers and mail to be led over the hill by rotary. The weather was causing newly cleared tracks to be covered again within an hour. Because the rotaries were so important, O'Neill knew exactly where all of his were. Trains 2 and 26 were being led by Plow X800. They were moving up the west slope. The X801 was moving up the western edge of the mountain to accompany train number 44, which had just left Everett. Westbound, train number 1, the Oriental Limited, had passed through Wellington about an hour earlier and was being guided by rotary X807. X802 was headed to meet westbound train number 25, the Seattle Express, with the passengers inside. It was on its way to Leavenworth at the east edge of O'Neill's territory. Train number 27 was approaching the Cascades and the highest priority train on the line, and the one that most worried O'Neill. It was the fast mail train, and it was rushing mail from St. Paul to Seattle in less than 48 hours. It was part of a national mail line that was aimed to have mail delivered from New York to the West Coast in 3 days. In order to make the deadline, the train had to move 60 miles an hour. It was implemented late in September 1909 and was a super profitable line in the Great Northern Network, but too many delays would cause the Postal Service to take the contract to a competing company. It had a perfect record until November of that year. On the 2nd, 14th, and 22nd, it ran hours late, and on December 5th, it was nearly 13 hours late because of heavy weather in the Cascade Mountains. And now, on February 22nd, it looked like it was going to have an even worse delay than that. It was already 6 hours behind after going through the Montana Rockies, and the current weather conditions in the Cascades would make it worse. So James had to decide where to send the X802. There were 2 first-class trains headed that way and only 1 snowplow. He could hold the Seattle Express at Leavenworth until the Priority Express caught up with it. That way, the plow could clear the track while the 2 trains followed behind it. But that would delay the Seattle Express for hours, and that train was just about as time-sensitive as the mail train. He could release the Seattle Express with the X802 clearing the way for it and hope that the fast mail was close enough behind that the snow wouldn't clog up the freshly cleared tracks before it was able to push through the area. It would be a risky chance to take and fully dependent on the hope that snow wouldn't start drifting. Choice number 3 was for James to request permission to send the train onto the tracks of an affiliated railroad that connected Spokane with the coast, the Northern Pacific or the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle. That was really only supposed to be done in times of desperation, like the main tracks being taken out by snowslides or some other dire situation. The routes he considered were way less likely to have issues, but still that was a choice O'Neill dreaded making himself. It would put the trains even more behind schedule, and he still wasn't at the point of needing to do something so drastic yet. There was also a little bit of ego involved. If O'Neill decided to take the route now, it would be the equivalent of admitting defeat, and even though he could tell that the storm looked like it was turning into much worse than it was, they weren't quite at that point yet. So he felt better off just staying the course. When the Oriental Limited came through an hour prior, O'Neill asked the engineer how he felt about the weather. The engineer's name was J.C. Wright, and he had been working with the division for 14 years. He told O'Neill he felt like this was the worst storm he had ever seen, especially right around Wellington, at the top of the line. On Wednesday, February 23rd, around 1:30 a.m., the Seattle Express pulled into the Leavenworth station. Most of the passengers were asleep, but Mrs. Blanche Painter wasn't. She was on her way home from Everett with a through ticket when she spontaneously decided to get off in Leavenworth to visit friends. She grabbed her luggage and got off the train. Why she planned to see friends at this hour is unknown. Hotels in the area wouldn't be open or have any availability for her to book for the night, but still, she deboarded and planned to continue her journey the next day. Leavenworth was at the foot of the mountain and was a place where crews could switch out and trains would replenish their water and coal supply. And it was here that Joseph Pettit took charge of the Seattle Express. Pettit was a normally nice guy to be around. He didn't come off as arrogant like many conductors did in the day, but tonight, Pettit wanted nothing more than to not have to deal with the inevitable complaints from passengers about delays. Looking up at the snowy peaks of the Cascade that he would be driving the train through, he knew it was a maze on normal days, but with the conditions tonight, the conductor knew it would be a dangerous maze that would be hard to see. Leavenworth was a cute small town, but it was also the marking point to where terrain became notably difficult going westward from there. The journey to Seattle from there required going through a tight opening in the mountain before following a river through a twisty canyon and navigating mountain peaks up to 8,000 feet high. Because of this, helper engines were added to one end of westbound trains to help them on their way to Seattle. In this case, the Seattle Express had the helper added onto the front. James O'Neill decided to let the Seattle Express go ahead without waiting on the fast mail. It looked like it was making good progress, and the wind hadn't picked up on the east slope yet as the fast mail left Spokane. The rails up to Stevens Pass were clear, so the fast mail should be able to catch up just fine. At 2:15 a.m., the X-802 left Leavenworth to clear the rails, and 15 minutes later, the Seattle Express took off behind it. Most of the passengers were asleep inside. Now, while they were sleeping, what probably didn't cross any of the passengers on the way to Seattle's mind was the fact that the Cascade Mountains were for the Oregon Trail what the Sierra Nevada Mountains were for the California Trail. Specifically, how they were for the Donner Party. I covered that story a few weeks ago. You can listen to it after this if you would like. I'll link it below if you haven't already. But the same way everything about the Sierra Nevada was difficult for those going to California, it was the exact same way for the Cascades with the Oregon Trail. There were very few passes that actually made it through the Cascade, and the forest was incredibly dense. There were barely any grass for cattle pulling wagons to graze on for those emigrating out west, so they would eat leaves instead. But the leaves were poisonous, which killed the animals faster than starvation did. They also had to deal with mudslides, rock slides, and avalanches too, so most travelers would settle east of the Cascades. Anyone that wanted to go past that would typically dismantle their wagons when they made it to the Cascades and built rafts to navigate the river going through it. The range isn't the steepest by any means. The Rocky Mountains that everyone had to go through were steeper, but it was the way the terrain was so unpredictable that made it dangerous. Walking blindly through snow in a valley only to realize you're one step away from walking off a cliff. Slabs of ice falling onto you from cliffs above. One misstep on one of the 1,000 peaks triggered a slide of some variety, and it was enough to wipe out everything on its way down. I bet none of the sleeping Seattle Express passengers thought about any of that. And why would they? They were also blissfully unaware of the history of that part of the national rail, how the government pushed to have that area developed, even when it wasn't quite ready, and how even Native Americans avoided that part of the mountain. Or how the officials at the Great Northern believed that the stretch of track they had to cross, Stevens Pass, was the weakest in the entire line. There were no signs or trails leading to or from it in any direction for 10 miles. There was no evidence that Stevens Pass was there at all. By the time the sleeping Seattle Express passengers woke up the next day, they realized the train had stopped. Edward Toppin, a 29-year-old on the Seattle Express, wrote to his mom. He mentioned how the last time he wrote to her, he said he expected to be in Seattle by now, but instead around 6:30 that morning, the train stopped. And now the snow was up to the top of the windows. The train couldn't go forwards or backwards, and no one could tell them when they could expect to get out. Now, Toppin was on the train as a traveling representative for his dad's company. It was a safety door hanger company in Ashland, Ohio, and Toppin's wife also recently passed away. He needed to get away from the memories back home, so he was on his way to Seattle to find leads for the company. He left his son with family while he was on the trip, and at first he was kind of relieved to get away from the happiness and excitement surrounding his sister's new engagement, considering he was still grieving after all. But this wasn't what he had in mind for his trip. Louis Jessup woke up expecting to hear the sound of the train moving along the tracks, and feeling it rock back and forth as it continued to Puget Sound. Instead, he heard nothing. So he moved the window shade to see where they were at, and all he saw was white. He threw on some clothes and left his sleeping place to go to the gentleman's lounge to shave and freshen up a little bit for the day. Lucius Anderson was the porter for the gentleman's lounge and from Mississippi. When Anderson walked in, Jessup greeted him and asked where they were. Anderson told him they were at the east end of the 2.5-mile tunnel at Cascade Station, under the Stevens Pass summit. The station was almost 3,400 feet or 1,000 meters up on the mountain, so Jessup asked him how long they had been there, and Anderson told him that it had been several hours, but they expected to move at any moment. The storm was just really bad. Then Jessup went to find John Merritt, the opposing lawyer, and the two started discussing the situation. They decided to go outside to look at everything for themselves, and when they stepped outside, Jessup, who had lived in the north his entire life, said he had never seen a snowstorm like this. He couldn't even make out what something beyond 25 feet away was. And it wasn't like there was wind, it was just a lot of snow coming down really fast. he didn't even realize that he couldn't make out the village below them. Cascade Station was pretty isolated. It was established 20 years earlier and pretty much just a few cottages for the crew to live in, makeshift shacks, and whatever basic equipment was needed to keep the trains moving. The people that lived there were the crew and down on their luck people who were hired as shovelers. Now back inside of the Seattle Express, conductor Joseph Pettit was walking around when passenger Henry White approached him. White boarded at the last station before the foothills and was a salesman for the American Paper Company. He lived in Seattle and was headed back there after being away on business. White had crossed the Cascades on a monthly basis for the past 6 years, but this was only his 4th trip on the Great Northern Line through Stevens Pass. Before boarding, he was worried about the incoming storm, especially because he had never been on a Great Northern train during weather like this. But when he got on, the train atmosphere was so calm, he wasn't worried anymore. He remembered how the snow shed when he boarded shielded him from snow falling and snow slides, so he was reassured seeing the snow plows clearing the track ahead of them. But right now, White approached Pettit to ask where the dining car was, and Pettit responded by telling him that there wasn't one on the train yet. It didn't usually join until the train was further down the line. Instead, they made arrangements for passengers to eat where the engine crew ate, the train beanery. A little after that, the train crew took the passengers in small groups and guided them off the train and to a shack that was pretty much just one room made of wood that was hammered together. It was also mostly buried under snow at this point. Inside, there was a huge heating stove at one end and a huge cooking stove at the other. There were 12 wooden tables inside, with dented tin cups and eating utensils placed on top of it. The cook and waiter working at the beanery were inside and knew how to batch cook, so they made a ton of pancakes, eggs, canned fruit, and what I believe was oatmeal. The passengers thought that the place was dirty, but the food was good. They all sat around trying to figure out what exactly was going on. West of the tunnel, one of the plows blocked the main line. They just needed to wait for it to be shoveled out, and then the Seattle Express could continue on, hopefully by noon, but nightfall at the latest. Jessup and Merritt knew this meant they would probably miss their court date in the morning, but they hoped that since they were both sides of the argument, the court wouldn't make a decision without them. On the train, Sarah Jane Covington had just woken up after sleeping in. She was 69 years old and traveling alone, a grandmother with distinctive white hair, and was on her way back home after visiting her son in Spokane for almost a month. He was hospitalized from an infected cat scratch, but doing better when she left. She was very eager to get back to Olympia to celebrate her 51st wedding anniversary on March 3rd. She was also well known for her charity work in Olympia, but no one on board knew her at all. Still, several passengers and crew offered to bring her breakfast from the beanery. She was worried after hearing of the delay, but took notes to pass the time. They included mentioning that the trains were warm and the mountains were beautiful. At this point, the fast mail train had been behind them for several hours. There were 8 clerks inside. One was 29-year-old Alfred B. Hensel. This delay wasn't his fault, but it still upset him. Hensel was a man who practiced his mail sorting skills in his bedroom during his free time. He had been a trained mail clerk for 6 years now, but he started working the Spokane to Seattle run 6 weeks ago and was clearly meticulous about his performance. He wasn't perfect, but his mind couldn't help but wander to the previous major delays. One serious incident was when a large locomotive was pushing his train up a steep track. It was too large for the station turntable, which is a rotating platform that turns locomotives so they can face a different direction. It's a large circular platform like a huge Lazy Susan, but built into the ground. The train drives onto the platform and then the entire thing rotates, manually or with a motor, to face a new direction, which is obviously great for trains since they can't do sharp turns like cars. When you need to reverse direction or move to a different track, the turntable spins them around to face the right way, which is super helpful for older trains like this that can't really run backwards at high speeds. But because it didn't fit, it was attached backwards at the end of Hensel's train. They were going through a curve when the water in the engine shifted and caused the train to flip. Hensel went through the skylight, and when it happened, his feet were injured. The year before that, on his way to Idaho, a bull charged the train he was working on at the time and completely derailed it. The bull didn't survive, but still, what are the odds? Now, Hensel was actually aware that in spring, mail contracts would be up for renewal, so a significant delay would put the Great Northern's contract at risk. On top of that, one of the chairmen for the company's board threatened to cut the fast mail service if they didn't expand and win over competitor contracts. Late February was apparently when the 4-year weighing of the mail happened. It was part of the process to determine how much mail the railway carried and would determine how much the post office paid for the next 4 years. The year prior, the Great Northern share of mail money was over $44 million. Today, that's the equivalent of more than $1.5 billion. So the pressure to stay on time was immense. The mail train didn't stop most of the time when delivering and picking up mail bags. It kept moving, and the crew just hustled to switch out the bags as the train went by each station. So I think it's safe to say a lot's riding on the mail service. It's not like Hensel and the others could do anything now, though. They already sorted the mail. All they could do was watch time pass and hope O'Neill would get crews moving again as soon as possible. What everyone on the Seattle Express didn't know was at the same time they were going through the first half of their day, on the other side of the mountain with O'Neill, things weren't going to plan at all. The weather had gotten so bad, he stopped all passenger trains. Around 9 a.m. on Wednesday, February 23rd, O'Neill hoped the storm and the issues would be over in the next 12 hours. But until then, he had to figure out what to do. He considered rerouting approaching trains to the Northern Pacific, the routes he dreaded having to request use of before. But that company ended up turning him away when he asked later because they were also having issues with snowslides too. So he reached out to his supervisors in St. Paul and Spokane and decided to have all trains headed for Stevens Pass to be held at their starting point. So anyone already en route would be turned around to go back if possible and then just rerouted later. The Seattle Express and Fast Mail would stay where they were until the tracks were clear. He then handed a telegraph to the on-duty operator that he wouldn't let trains go through his division until it was clear. He had it sent to all the higher-ups all across the country, and knowing how expensive of a decision he just made was, I know he hated doing it. But here's what he knew. The X-807 conducted by Homer Purcell left Wellington around 3:30 a.m., going west to catch an eastbound train on its way to Stockholmish. He only made it a little more than a mile from Wellington when Purcell ran into a 200-foot-long and 20-feet-deep snowslide. Apparently, that was considered a minor slide for the area, but the type of slide is what made it difficult to move. They called it cascade cement. It was wet and heavy and the type of snow that easily clogged the rotary plow's cutting wheel and completely stalled it. Add that to the fact that the plow had been jammed so far into the side of the pusher engine it couldn't pull back out. Purcell had to send for more shovelers in Wellington, and that alone took 4 hours. By that time, the Seattle Express and the Fast Mail had made it close to Stevens Pass. So O'Neill decided to stop both trains east of the Summit Ridge at Cascade Tunnel Station, where the weather wasn't as extreme. The two trains were effectively sidetracked, but the hope was that the delay would only be a few hours. The tracks would be clear, the trains could go through the tunnel to Wellington and down the west slope of the Cascade. Unfortunately, reality was very different. Right after Purcell pushed through the first snowslide, he ran into a second one after only moving 1 mile. Shed 3.3 was beside it, near a place called Windy Point. This slide was bigger than the last, so he knew they would need at least half a day to clear it. He informed Wellington of the situation, and I'm sure poor O'Neill was about ready to lose it. He hadn't slept in 24 hours, and this wasn't the only problem he was dealing with. There were blocked tracks and slides all over, and the next worst situation was at Scenic Hot Springs. Passenger train number 44 was eastbound, leaving the station when it ran into the back of the rotary plow. The visibility was so bad the train conductor didn't actually see it in front of him. The plow wasn't really damaged at all. The crew inside didn't even realize they'd been hit because of how loud the rotary and the wind outside were. The passenger train, however, broke into several pieces on impact, and that was the first half of O'Neill's day. He was going all in on his chain-smoking habit and completely dumbfounded at the snowdrift. Of course, cigarettes in Washington at this time were illegal, so he was chain-smoking cigars. Anything not moving was getting buried under the snow, even in the areas without wind. He had almost all 300 of the temporary shovelers working to keep the Seattle Express and Fast Mail free of snowdrifts, and they were barely keeping up. With issues popping up all over the place, resources were being stretched thin, and constantly moving people around to tackle the new issues meant the old ones got worse. That very day, the Seattle Times released a paper about the 6 trains stranded on the mountain in 4 to 5 feet of snow. Back inside of the Seattle Express, It's around 1 p.m., and Edward Toppin started writing again. He wrote about how his wife died 6 months ago, and his baby was now 22 months old. He wrote about the other passengers, like Ida Starrett's 8-month-old baby named Francis, and how he was squirming around. Ida Starrett was on the train with her 3 kids beside her, and her elderly parents nearby. They all boarded back in Spokane. She was recently widowed and torn between staying in Spokane or moving back with her parents to Canada. Her parents wanted her to move back, but all she knew at that moment was that none of her kids would settle down. At some point, the Seattle Express moved forward into the tunnel so that the fast meal could access the water tank. Apparently, the tunnel was very unpleasant and smelled of gasoline. It was cold and dirty, and Joseph Pettit heard mouthfuls of complaints from passengers for the 30 minutes they were inside. Believe it or not, the tunnel was an improvement. The first 7 years of the Great Northern's paths through that area, there was no tunnel. It didn't seem financially worth it to dig through 3 miles of granite to make a tunnel, so the trains were actually pulled through using switchbacks. There were 8 long curved segments that zigzagged up the summit, and this is straight from the book because I have a hard time wrapping my head around this, but there were 110-ton locomotives added to the front and the back of the train where it would be hauled up one segment of the track, it would stop, reverse, and then go up the next leg in the opposite direction. 3 reverses were needed to lift the train to the east summit of the pass, and 5 more were needed to go down the west side. And it was all at a 3.5 to 4% grade, which is insane because apparently freight train gradients should be as gentle as possible, ideally below 1.5%. High-speed railways are usually around 2.5 to 4% because the trains have to be strong with a lot of wheels to reach their higher speeds. 4% and up is usually reserved for metros and tramways because all the wheels are connected to engine power, and they're typically lighter. But the maneuver required special trained staff and was so tedious that each locomotive went through 3,000 pounds of coal doing it. It was 12 miles in length and could be completed anywhere from around 75 minutes to 36 hours. It was nicknamed Death Mountain, and as insane as it sounds, according to the book on this story, it was safe. There had never been any accidents, including 1 year when 140 feet of snow fell at Stevens Pass. I'm honestly having a hard time wrapping my head around what it would have been like in a train doing switchbacks up a mountain so we can go in every direction to save a bit of money. And let's not forget the snowy conditions. The 1800s in America, insanity. Although once the economy recovered, a few years later, they had the tunnel built, which was a beast to build in and of itself, and had, quote, 800 men working, 800 men sleeping, and 800 men at the bar, end quote. But the truth was that it was such a hard job that turnover rates were 50% per month, and they were pretty much all temporary laborers because they couldn't get anyone else to do it. Eventually, the area was filled with violence, drinking, and ladies of the night because those were the only types willing to continue working or staying in the area. But it was finished in December 1900. The next problem was the 1.9% grade that caused the steam locomotives to produce a ton of smoke, gas, fumes, and heat that led to ventilation issues, like upwards of 200 degrees Fahrenheit or 93 Celsius. The crew would bury themselves in piles of coal to escape the heat. The emergency phones in the tunnel didn't work because of how hot it was. Workers literally died when the trains got stuck, and they had to go out to figure out what went wrong. Once a train with more than 100 passengers stopped running in the tunnel, the conductor, engineer, and firemen all passed out from the gas fumes when they were trying to figure out how to fix it. An off-duty fireman inside managed to release the brakes on the train after the passenger car started filling with fumes too. The train began rolling downhill, backwards, and went out of the tunnel at Wellington. Luckily, the fireman was aware enough to hit the emergency brakes, and the train stopped in the Wellington yard. Everyone inside, including the crew, were unconscious. But everyone survived. The fireman's name was Abbott, and he received a citation and a $1,000 check from the chairman of the Great Northern. And after so many close calls and more than a few deaths, the press started going after the company and forced the chairman to get electric motors to move the trains from Wellington to Cascade Tunnel Station in 1909. And it didn't fix all the issues. The electric motors would fail, so steam engines had to pull the trains through, and the lack of ventilation still wasn't fixed. Now, before going to bed early that night, the passengers were able to see in the eastbound lane the snowplow being turned into a superplow, with a rotary on both ends so it wouldn't have to turn around to clear the track. Edward Toppin wrote that the outlook appeared as though they'd be stuck all night, and after he and most of the passengers were asleep, the crew were still working. After the rotary was assembled, it took 3 hours to get the plows and the engines filled up at the water tank. Purcell's plow took a long time to work through the snow slab by Windy Point. The shovelers were too tired to continue helping get the snow down to 13 feet, which is the max depth the rotaries could handle. So instead of it being the temporary workers hired to clear the snow, the actual train crew was outside working to clear the snow instead. And it was after nightfall when Purcell made it through and could keep moving west. Now, after midnight, making it Thursday, February 24th, O'Neill knew he wouldn't be getting sleep again tonight. He only allowed himself to rest in short intervals and would occasionally find time to eat meals the steward made him inside of his business car. Things that typically only took a few minutes now took hours because of the snow. For example, to put coal and water on 2 engines and 2 rotaries usually took a maximum of 20 minutes, but right now, it was taking up to 4 hours. O'Neill had 3 telegraph operators in Wellington office working in 8-hour shifts, and the one pulling the overnight shift was only on his 3rd day on the job in the division. His name was W.V. Avery, and he was from the South and not familiar with northern storms at all, but his first shift started 4 hours before this storm did, which was certainly a time to start the job, but he knew O'Neill's next problem to tackle was the coal supply. Trains usually refilled their coal supply at Leavenworth on the east side of the mountains or Skycomish to the west. Wellington wasn't a supply station, but O'Neill had 140 tons of coal stocked there on a typical day. He liked to keep a lot of coal stocked on the mountain, especially during snowstorm season. But, of course, things happened this week. There was the switchman's strike still happening, so, of course, an extra 4 cars of coal were left at Leavenworth. The supply he usually kept at Wellington was usually more than enough for snowstorms, but with the trains running and using coal 24/7 right now, it wasn't enough. He had previously sent off a hostile telegraph to the chief dispatcher at Everett, just asking when he would have coal delivered to them. But considering no regular trains were in operation in the area, the guy couldn't actually send anything. The only thing that made O'Neill feel better was knowing that the entire northwestern region was struggling in the storm, and especially anyone with tracks going through the cascade. So he wasn't alone in shutting down at least. Several lines had stopped operations entirely or had stalled trains all over. At around 2 a.m. on Thursday, Purcell pulled into the Wellington station. After leaving the tunnel, he ran into X801, conducted by Arthur Blackburn, who was moving east from Scenic. They both went to a small station named Alvin, combined into the double rotary, and went back towards Wellington. The trip was less than 4 miles, but it took them 5 hours, with them having to clear the tracks on the way. O'Neill, taking this as his chance to get things moving, quickly ordered exhausted men to go to Scenic to help clear the line. Meanwhile, he contacted the operator at Cascade Tunnel Station and told him to get the Seattle Express and Fast Mail ready to move. And a bit after that, the snow started letting up, so O'Neill thought the storm was probably over. The storm had already gone on way longer than usual for the area, but it wasn't so much longer that he was wrong to think it was over. Besides, if it was over, he could get home to his wife and baby for the weekend. So O'Neill sent out telegrams to everyone saying he believed they would be fully open and moving by 6 a.m. Thursday. Unfortunately, 4:30 a.m. came around, and so did the storm. It was back full force. And before Purcell and Blackburn had even finished refilling the water tank, so they weren't able to start heading back until after 6 a.m., and O'Neill was forced to send a telegram to headquarters around 8 a.m. saying things were clearly worse than before. The snow would cover the tracks immediately after a plow went over it, and workers were too exhausted and refused to continue shoveling the tracks. O'Neill took this as an excuse to leave the office that he was filling up with smoke to go up the mountain for himself and see what could be done. The papers that morning published that he reopened the tracks, and O'Neill was determined to at least get the 2 trains down the mountain. So James O'Neill and his assistant, trainmaster, took another double rotary that had been repaired during the time the snow slowed down, and they headed to Cascade Tunnel. On the Seattle Express, the passengers woke up late Thursday morning to a similar yet different scene. They were still on the train, and there was still snow falling, but the snowflakes were bigger, heavier, but less in number. so the visibility was better and they could see their surroundings easier, even if they couldn't quite make out what anything was under all the snow. They had heard that the snow in Wellington was 20 feet deep and came back as fast as it was moved. The snow where they were at fell another 13 feet in 12 hours. So breakfast in the beanery that morning was uncomfortable, and the lack of moving trains meant replenishing the food supply wasn't possible. They had to consider possibly starting to ration the food. The telegraph line on the eastern slope had been taken out by a snowslide, and for Sarah Covington, this was concerning because the day before she told her son she was safe, but now she felt alone without a way to communicate with her family. She wasn't able to contact her husband, her 7 children, or her 22 grandchildren. The dual lawyers, Joseph and Merritt, sat around thinking about how they were supposed to be in court, but instead they were stuck on a train, and that their case was being called without them even being there. Even though Joseph hoped the court wouldn't continue, they ended up siding with Merritt based on the written record. Some young adults from the train were entertaining themselves outside, and the younger children were finding entertainment inside. Some passengers passed the time by trying to help other passengers feel better or keep their mind off the situation. Conductor Pettit spent his time trying to keep the 55 train passengers reassured inside. While he wasn't outside working on the train like most of the crew, he worked hard to have the patience to deal with the passengers. He was a father to 5 children, and his mind would more than occasionally wander to them while he kept everyone at ease inside the train. Then there were the more delicate passengers. 39-year-old Ada Lemon was suffering from some sort of nervous condition. She was traveling with her husband Edgar, who was an attorney. They were on their way to a hospital for specialized treatment due to her always being borderline hysterical. John Gray had his leg in a heavy cast, and he couldn't be moved from his bed. He was on the train with his wife, Anna, and their 18-month-old son, Varden. 60-year-old J.R. Vale was a sheep herder with a swollen abscess or boil on his neck, and he had a professional nurse traveling with him, 26-year-old Catherine O'Reilly from a hospital in Spokane. Edward Toppin, in good health, physically anyway, started losing his composure, at least in his notes. He was frustrated, he couldn't go outside for a change of scenery, and to exercise. He was also upset about the state of the inside of the beanery. He went as far as to start calling the crew the scum of the earth, although that changed a little when he saw them back outside working to clear the tracks. And everyone's attitude shifted a little when they noticed the rotary returned and was clearing the area between the train and the tunnel. James O'Neill arrived with that rotary and went into the station to give orders to the station operator before grabbing a shovel to help clear snow outside. Considering he was the highest-ranking person in the division, seeing him get outside and work with his subordinates was a big deal for the crew. It was also why everyone liked and respected O'Neill. He brought himself up from nothing after moving from Canada, and after moving through the ranks, he had no problem getting down and dirty, even if it was technically viewed as being beneath his pay grade. He didn't do it for show, he did it because it needed to be done, and he wanted to help his men. They were all tired and sleep-deprived, and this wasn't part of his job at all, but he still did it. Around 5 p.m., the snow had stopped, and the trains were warming up. O'Neill sent a telegraph indicating that the trains were about to be on the move. Things ended up taking a bit longer, though, because the rotary kept being thrown off-center, so they had to spend some time fixing it. Then, once the trains were cleared of snow, they wouldn't budge. So O'Neill and the workers had to individually go through and unbuckle every train car, dislodge it, and then reassemble it. And during that time, a snowslide took out the power and communication lines for the tunnel somewhere east of them. So they had to use steam locomotives to pull the trains through, which was bad because of the ventilation issue. They couldn't use the electric motors. But it was made easier because gravity would pull the trains down, so they could just kind of drift along without pushing the trains too hard and causing everyone to asphyxiate inside. With the trains on the move, O'Neill got on the rotary and made his way to Wellington. He needed to send another update to his supervisors, except when he made it to Wellington, he saw the plow Purcell and Blackburn were supposed to be taking to Scenic and clear the track for the trains still at the Wellington station. Another snowslide fell in the exact same spot near Windy Point. When they went to push through it with the plow, the rotary took in a fallen tree stump and it broke several mechanisms inside of the plow. The crew tried to fix it up, but it wasn't able to do any kind of heavy-duty clearing. O'Neill knew the trains couldn't stay at the tunnel station with the food supply lessening quickly, knowing the workers that lived there needed to have food to eat, but the trains also couldn't continue to Scenic, so he decided to keep the trains at Wellington until the tracks were clear. It would take at least a few hours, but the trains could be put on the passing tracks west of the station, and the passengers could go to the Baylitz Hotel for dinner. It was sort of a hostel for railroaders, but it also housed the town's general store and post office. The owner always had extra food on hand, and who didn't love more business? The passengers made it there around 7:45 p.m., and a snow gauge indicated that there was 17 feet of snow, with light snow still falling. While everyone ate dinner, Conductor Pettit tried to reassure everyone that they would only be there a few more hours. No one believed him, though, because at that point he sounded like a broken record. He said that same line every day, several times a day. The passengers knew it would take another day or two with how things were going so far. After that, the passengers explored the small, almost non-existent town of Wellington, with just a few businesses and homes. There was so little there that it was once nicknamed the end of the world. It pretty much only existed for the Great Northern. It was mostly entirely filled with single male employees of the company. Around 10:15 p.m., the fast mail pulled onto the sidetrack beside the Seattle Express as everyone settled in for the night. At the same time, X808, the fifth snowplow, made it to Scenic, which allowed several eastbound trains to return to Seattle from Skykomish and Scenic. They had been stranded since Wednesday. The plow was also pulling 2 cars of coal up the west slope that it got from Skykomish. If everyone at Wellington conserved their coal, they should be able to hold on long enough for the 2 carts to make it to them. Now, since the rotary plow crew had been working for 2 days straight, they needed to rest. So O'Neill switched out the plow crews with men working on the electric motors, and he and Blackburn would take the double rotary to clear the slide near Windy Point. Someone else would take rotary X808 to clear the slide that took out the power lines to the east. So now on Friday, February 25th, the passengers woke up around 10 a.m. to their trains being hit with 50-mile-per-hour winds. It was snowing hard, and around noon, news started going around. Just a few hours after those 2 trains left Cascade Tunnel Station, an avalanche hit the beanery and killed the cook and his waiter, Harry Elliker and John Garrison. They were inside working at the time. Harry had just loaded food into the oven. The news was startling to the passengers of the Seattle Express. Women turned hysterical, and men turned somber. It was made worse when they finally looked at where they were actually now located. They were on tracks, on a ledge, where just to the left of them was a 55-foot drop into Tie Creek. To the right, a 2,000-foot slope going straight up. The women asked the conductor to move the train anywhere but where they were. They suggested going back to the tunnel, but the conductor, knowing about the ventilation issue, felt it would be more dangerous. And everyone would have to walk through water in the tunnel to go eat in the hotel. And in general, the crew weren't too concerned. And the male passengers weren't outwardly voicing their distress at that point. So with the women's request being dismissed, they pretty quickly settled down. When O'Neill caught wind of the avalanche, he wasn't surprised like everyone else. He hoped something like this wouldn't happen, but he feared that it would. And he couldn't help but remember an incident that happened soon after he was appointed superintendent back in 1907. Great Northern Train Number 4 was going uphill to Wellington in warming conditions. A mile past Windy Point, the train left one snow shed on its way to another when an avalanche came down and covered the entrance to the snow shed it was approaching. The train engineer panicked and called for a full reverse. People and objects inside the train fell down when it switched directions so quickly. Going back towards the shed they left, they made it 50 feet from the entrance when the engineer braked, placing the train under the shed roof. Just then, another avalanche came down the mountain and covered the front end of the shed. 30 seconds after that, another avalanche fell on the back of the train, which completely trapped them inside the shed. It's unknown why the engineer didn't just stop when he saw the first avalanche instead of flying into reverse, but the train was trapped there for days. Everyone inside ate the food stored in the train, and the coal had to be rationed. And after being stuck there for 10 days, they decided to leave the train and hike to Wellington. The weather the day of the slides was similar to what it was now, and it didn't help that the plows decided they weren't going to work anymore, but at least help was on the way. There was the guy hauling coal from Scenic, there was another plow on its way from another division east of them, and there were 2 relief trains filled with men and equipment on the way too, one from the east and one from the west. O'Neill also had someone buying coal from wherever the guy could find it, and since it wasn't wholesale from a distributor, The prices were egregious, but they were desperate. The guy bringing the coal from Scenic was still hours away, so he had to. By Friday evening, inside the Seattle Express, 30-year-old Libby Latch was restless. She wanted to smoke, but the gentleman's lounge was off limits. She was married with a young child, but alone on the train. She was headed back to Seattle, where she lived, and where her hair accessory company that she started was located. Porter Anderson found somewhere for her to smoke, so she would settle down, although her smoking cigarettes was distasteful to other passengers just due to it being illegal in Washington, and Sarah Covington disapproved of Libby Latch's smoking and everyone else's gambling and drinking and any attempts to pass their time because she preferred to dive into literature. Henry White, getting fed up with the wait and feeling like he traveled more than enough to know his traveling rights, gathered other prominent men on the train to discuss next steps. 50-year-old Charles Eltinge was part of the meeting. He just retired from his position as vice president of Traders National Bank in Spokane. He was married with 5 kids, but alone on the train. He wanted to complain directly to O'Neill. Lawyers Jessup and Merritt weren't ready to go that far, though. To them, it seemed like the company was doing everything they could to help them. They also felt acquainted with O'Neill after his efforts trying to clear the tracks before. White asked the station secretary, 19-year-old Earl Longcoy, to contact O'Neill and have him meet them that night to answer their questions and concerns. Longcoy told them that he would let O'Neill know, and as more time passed, more arguments broke out. Women wanting to move somewhere safe, men complaining about how this affected their schedules, and everyone but the crew worried about more slides. At one point, Conductor Pettit told everyone that never in all his years working the area had there been a slide where they were located, to which the passengers then pointed out there also hadn't been a slide where the beanery was, and everyone saw what happened there. But the truth was, no one in the area was an expert on snowslides, and the passengers only knew what they had heard from the telegraphs from their families. By nightfall, O'Neill hadn't shown, and the passengers were becoming very angry. Every now and then, a rotary plow would go by on a refueling run and push snow onto the train, which just made everyone increasingly upset considering how long it would probably take to shovel the extra snow that was now covering the lines from the plows moving past. What they didn't know was that O'Neill was probably about an eyelash away from losing it. For him, on Saturday, February 26th, near Windy Point, just before 4 a.m., O'Neill managed to get through the snow slides that fell and blocked the way again. He knew the guy coming from Scenic had to get through almost 9 miles of track to make it to Wellington with the coal, but no one had heard from him. So he sent another train master, William Harrington, with 2 crews of men to clear the Cascade Tunnel. They were using a rotary and 2 pusher engines, one from the Seattle Express, and it still took 6 hours for them to clear the snow. After that, they cleared the area where the beanery was hit, and then proceeded to an area where there should be more coal. The coal was running low, and the only reason they went back to Wellington was to find enough to get them down the mountain to where there would hopefully be more. Harrington's 2 crews were working around the clock to make progress, and with the occasional snow slides as they moved, he knew to be worried. Avalanches happen in clusters. Rarely is there just one. If one happens, the next question should be, where will the rest hit? So Harrington moved cautiously but quickly, knowing the wind and warming weather meant Stevens Pass above them would be in danger of snow falling down. He really just wanted to go home to his wife and 3 kids. The only way he could do that was to wrap this up. 2/3 of the year he worked as a conductor, but during this part of the year, he was a train master. He preferred being a conductor because then he could be home more. Back with O'Neill, all he knew was that he couldn't see either rotary on either side of the mountain, and the guy from Scenic was still closer to Scenic than Windy Point. The guys working with him at Wellington were needing rest. Complaints were more frequent, and everyone moved slower. He had heard about the passengers' complaints the night before, and he had also heard about how the passengers were taunting shovelers to move faster. He just wasn't in the mood to deal with their predictable complaints. He knew they wanted to move, and he understood why. By all appearances, where they were looked concerning, especially considering they weren't familiar with the area. But to O'Neill, they were safe. He knew that the slides usually happened when there were rivers or dips nearby. Like the beanery had a small gully above it, but where the 2 trains were at, there were no interruptions in the mountainside. If there was, there would be a snow shed, which is why they were placed along the route, to protect the tracks where there were interruptions in the terrain above it. And to be honest, there just wasn't anywhere practical to put the two trains. The tunnel wasn't safe and not happening, and Snow Shed 2 west of Wellington could only cover one train, and they would have to be on the main track, which would effectively block the plow's ability to get to the water tank and coal chute. It would also just put the train in an area expecting and susceptible to slides. That's why the shed was there. He could try moving them to a flat area near the tunnel portal, the spur tracks, but that would require all of the men on the mountain to clear the snow there for 2 days. Not to mention, it just plain went against standard operating procedure and was an area known for slides during the crazy switchback days. O'Neill felt they needed to stay where they were. Luckily, by Monday, the workers had raided enough abandoned locomotives and shed to find enough coal to completely fill the plow, giving them 10 to 20 hours worth of time. This was great news, so O'Neill and the 35 men working with him at the time boarded the plow and made their way back to Wellington. After that, he hoped to catch up to the guy coming from Scenic. Unfortunately, on their way back, in the same spot it was twice before, near Windy Point, there was another snowslide. And it was a 1,500-foot or 450-meter long one, too. I just know O'Neill was sick to his stomach seeing it there. Some parts were only 10 feet deep, but others went up to 30 feet, and it would easily take another day to clear it. But instead of quitting or resigning or throwing in the towel to go home, O'Neill went back to the plow and told the shovelers to get to work. Back at Wellington on the Seattle Express, Edward Toppin heard that it was possible they would get out before Sunday, but he didn't really believe it at all. The children on the train were done with this nightmare trip too. There were 4 boys and 4 girls. Some got along fine, but others did not. The adults tried to occupy them with snowball fights, having the girls do sewing circles, and Porter Lucius Anderson tried dancing to keep them entertained. Henry White and the other men were stewing in anger over still not seeing O'Neill. They asked Longcoy where O'Neill was, so he told them what O'Neill told him to say. O'Neill was busy and then too tired to come out to meet them last night, and by now he was in Scenic working. This wasn't true. O'Neill was battling the nightmare repeat-offending snowslide by Windy Point, but they didn't know that, and it's unclear if Longcoy knew he was there too. So then when White demanded Longcoy send a telegraph or man to Scenic to demand to speak to O'Neill and have him come talk to them immediately, Longcoy lied and said O'Neill was sick in bed and couldn't get away. That lie would bite him in the butt later on because 2 days later, spoiler alert, they will be on the train for another 2 days. But White asked Conductor Pettit about how O'Neill was feeling, and Pettit told him O'Neill was fine. White clarified asking if O'Neill had been sick, and the conductor was kind of confused, but he was like, no, O'Neill is feeling fine. So White didn't act on the fact that someone wasn't being truthful, but later when he asked the conductor about progress, he told them they should be moving today. So that clearly indicated he hadn't heard about the 3rd snow slide by Windy Point. Meanwhile, Louis Jessup grilled the local mountain men and hotel workers about snowslides in the area, and everyone told him where they were at was safe. They had never had a slide there. The women started breaking down in tears, specifically the ones who had young children on the train. Nervous Ada Lemon was especially hysterical, even though her kid was a 16-year-old daughter and nowhere near the danger at all. The crying was so bad, the men left the train, and the crying got worse when the women saw shovelers leaving in groups of 3 and 4. As the shovelers left, they taunted the passengers the same way the passengers taunted them. And it was revealed while they walked off, they were leaving because they only made 15 cents an hour before housing deductions. When White asked Longcoy about the wages, he lied and said they made 30 cents an hour, which is still terrible sounding to me, but that's less than $5 today. The workers leaving made some of the passengers want to leave too, and they figured they could follow the tracks of the workers down to Scenic. 50-year-old Solomon Cohen voiced the idea. He was a shopkeeper from Everett and wanted to get home to his wife and 5 children. It was too late to leave when they got the idea, but people made plans to leave the next morning. Although, the drive to leave faded when the weather started warming and rainwater started running down the train and the mountain. That night, to the east, Harrington and crew and the plow were fighting to push through snowslides. After spending 12 hours working on only one slide, they were almost through their coal supply. They still had hope, though. They were 9 miles east of Cascade Tunnel, and there was only drifted snow on the tracks. Until, out of nowhere, an avalanche came down one side of the 1,000-foot wide valley and pushed up the other side, almost taking them out and effectively cutting them off. Harrington tried to push through the snow, but he realized he would burn through the rest of the coal before they made it to their destination. They couldn't try to go back because snowslides had fallen behind them since they left the tunnel, so Harrington left 5 men with the plow and had the rest walk with him the 9 miles back to Cascade Tunnel. Apparently, it can take up to 12 hours to start a large steam engine up once it's cold, so it was best to leave it running with just a few men overseeing its care. Back with O'Neill, they had resorted to ramming the plow into the Cascade cement from the third slide. They would back the plow up like 15 feet and then go full force into the snow until it stopped pushing out snow, and then they repeated it. That was the best method they had, and it only moved them like 8 inches of snow at a time. So after spending most of Saturday doing that, the coal started running low, so O'Neill had it sent back to Wellington to replenish if there was anything left to use. It was a much-needed break for the temporary workers who were clearly ready to walk off the job, and for his loyal employees that he had to push harder to make up for their slack, it was a break for them too. O'Neill wasn't in charge of their wages, otherwise he would just bribe them with more money. The higher-ups were, and the former company head, that was now a chairman, was loudly and proudly against worker blackmail and fair wages. On the way back to Wellington, the Rotary ran into another problem. They were less than 2 miles away from the coal chute when a 900-foot-long, 30 feet deep snowslide fell behind them. It was filled with timber and debris and would easily take at least 48 hours to get through. And that's if there was even enough coal at Wellington for there to use for the Rotary. O'Neill knew that the 2 trains weren't going anywhere until outside help came. So he sent the double Rotary to a safe spot and had foremen stay with it to keep it running. Then O'Neill and the rest of the crew walked back to Wellington, defeated and completely unsure of when the trains could even try to be freed. He was down to 1 Rotary plow. He knew help was on the way, but it wasn't there yet. There were even 20 men being sent from Everett to assist. And after all of that, the extra shovelers gave O'Neill an ultimatum. They demanded 50 cents per hour, or they would walk. That was apparently very high in 1910 for unskilled labor. It was kind of silly for them to demand it at that moment too, considering without the Rotary, it didn't matter what they did or didn't do unless they would be able to clear the entirety of the tracks by themselves. Without the Rotary, nothing could be done. And O'Neill wasn't one to back down from confrontation. He once tossed 3 armed robbers off the day coach on a train. But still, he approached the workers later on to appease them and offered them a raise to 20 cents an hour. They refused, only wanting the 50 cents. So he told them to get out, and they did. So many of them took off that there were barely enough left to keep Wellington Yard clear. Not that it mattered too much in this moment, considering nothing was running. He left Trainmaster Blackburn in charge at Wellington and went down to Scenic. He had to get there before the relief train arrived in the morning. It would have fuel, cargo, and men ready to be dispatched appropriately. Since he couldn't send a telegraph with orders down the line, he had to go there himself. And that night he slept in his business car. It was the first time since Tuesday that he had more than 1 hour of sleep. Now, that night, back on the Seattle Express, Edgar Lemons called a meeting. His hysterical wife was getting worse, and something needed to be done. Some members wanted to move into the tunnel. Others wanted to know if it was possible for O'Neill to have a doctor sent to help with the sick passengers. The conversation didn't really result in any actual decisions being made, and it died down until Conductor Pettit walked in to deliver the bad news. The coal supply had completely run out. So, if the tunnel or tracks were clear and safe to move to, which they weren't, they couldn't do either option. Wellington didn't have enough fuel, and the Seattle Express only had 1 engine since the other was being used on a Rotary. With that, passengers were divided on what to do. Some were still pushing to have the train move to a tunnel. Others wanted to follow the workers' footprints down to Scenic, but most were content to just trust the company and stay. Although everyone probably agreed that they would only ever make this trip again in the spring or fall. On the morning of Sunday, February 27th, 57-year-old James Thompson held a church service on the Seattle Express. He was a minister from Bellingham, married with 2 adult sons, and the sermon focused on verses from Psalms that spoke of the Lord being their strength and light. Sarah Covington approved of how just about every passenger and crew member was in attendance, because of course she would, and the service was much needed, but after it ended, the serenity disappeared. O'Neill had walked down to Scenic to find somewhere to send a telegraph, and the passengers didn't like that their concerns weren't being directly addressed. By this time, Harrington and his crew made it to Wellington after the brutal 9-mile hike back that took the entire night in the storm. The passengers were made aware of what had been going on while they demanded to hear from O'Neill. And now, the passengers, realizing just how dire the situation was, came up with more ideas. One suggested contacting the news and telling them what was going on. Others really wanted to try the journey to Scenic, but none of the workers were willing to guide the way for them and knew the journey was a death trap. But over the past 5 days on the train, a lot of the passengers became close, and they even had nicknames for each other. Upon actually planning to leave, though, not as many passengers were willing to do the journey. Joseph, Merritt, and a George Loveberry were serious about the trip, though, and they gathered their belongings, gave them to the porter with instructions on what to do with them if they made it to Seattle, and left, hoping to follow O'Neill down the mountain. Sunday morning for O'Neill was spent checking in with the status of X-808, the last working rotary on the mountain, and coming up with a plan to evacuate the stranded passengers down the mountain. The men and most women would probably be fine, but he had to think about the sick, the elderly, and the children. But thinking about his own journey down the mountain and how difficult it was seemed unlikely. There were times where he and the men he was traveling with were just in a barely controlled fall. At one point, they were just crawling on their hands and knees for like 2,000 feet. And then unexpectedly, the snow they were moving on turned into an avalanche without warning. It took out one of the men walking with them and killed him. At that point, O'Neill realized trying to get the passengers down like this was too dangerous to try. Higher up on the mountain, Sunday, Joseph, Merritt, and Loveberry were walking down the slopes. They ran into 2 18-year-old passengers, Milton Horn and Frank Ritter, who were outside exploring. Seeing the 3 men heading to Scenic, they decided to tag along. One of them was missing classes in Portland and knew he needed to get out of there. So they all continued down the mountain, and they were hit with pretty strong winds. So they took shelter in a shed, and most of them considered turning back, except for Loveberry. He was full steam ahead, determined to get down the mountain. So the men kept with him, and they struggled to keep moving, sinking into the deep snow and gaining a new understanding for why the plows had such a hard time clearing the snow. When they realized they were standing on top of a telegraph pole buried in the snow. Continuing on, they ran into the few men left behind to keep the double rotary running. The workers told the passengers about the man walking with O'Neill that was taken out by the avalanche. This scared them and made them sad, and continuing on to see workers trying to repair the telegraph and telephone lines made it worse. Those workers warned them to turn around because if they kept going, they were going to die. The 5 passengers almost turned around, but they couldn't because the snowslides that were falling behind them when they went down made it impossible to turn back. After about 4 hours of walking, they made it to a snow shed by Windy Point. At the back of it, there was a peephole where they could look to see the lights of Scenic down below. It was very steep, about 1,000 feet down, and could very easily turn into an avalanche if they tried to go. But the men felt like they had no choice, because being stuck on the train for any longer also wasn't an option. They decided to squat and slide down, but almost immediately, Joseph and Merritt started tumbling. If the snow wasn't so deep that everything, including the trees, was buried beneath it, they would have hit everything on the way down. But all 5 men survived the fall down. They were a little banged up, but they celebrated with a few drinks from Merritt's flask. Then they walked to the Scenic Hot Springs Hotel, a couple hundred feet away. The scene was chaotic because the relief train had arrived, and O'Neill was giving out orders. To everyone's surprise, the guy who they heard was taken out by the avalanche was actually alive and helping out. He had a few cuts and bruises and a dislocated knee, but he managed to somehow grab a tree during the fall and hung on to it while the avalanche continued past him. After that, he crawled on his hands and knees to the creek at the bottom of the slope before heading to Scenic. Hearing the story, Merritt decided to send a telegraph to those still on the train. It said that they made it safe, but it was too dangerous for anyone to try and come, so they should stay with the train. The telegraph never actually reached them, though. All 5 men caught a small train back to Skycomish, where they took another train to the coast. Jessup and Merritt made it to Seattle 14 hours after leaving the train, and they wouldn't hear what happened to everyone else they left for another 30-plus hours. Around 4:30 p.m. Sunday evening, the workers fixing the telephone lines restored them, and the operator at the Wellington office sent a communication to division headquarters. While there, he saw his first avalanche going down the mountain in an area similar to the one where the 2 trains were in front of. The area had a similar sparse forest layout due to frequent wildfires, steep slope, and everything. He told the dispatcher about it, and although his account can't totally be believed due to it being written 50 years after everything happened, and it being overly dramatic, it seems he may have actually said something, because a message was sent to Conductor Pettit that said to use every precaution possible for the safety of the passengers, and if necessary, back the trains into the tunnel. Of course, the tracks were completely covered in snow, they couldn't move, but the message was hand-delivered to Pettit anyway. When he brought the message to the conductor, they walked away a little bit and looked up at the slopes over the train, and Pettit made note that no matter what choice he made, the blame would be on him. If he didn't move the trains, and an avalanche somehow took them out, it would be on him. If he wasted the last bit of coal they had moving the trains into the tunnel and there was no avalanche, the blame would be on him. He knew what they were doing, and he knew that they knew he wasn't qualified to be able to spot avalanche conditions. But at the end of the day, the decision to move the train or not really fell on Trainmaster Blackburn and O'Neill. So the 2 of them spoke on the phone a few hours after this, and although the dispatcher could hear Blackburn telling O'Neill that the passengers were still worried about slides, the avalanche that he spotted earlier was never mentioned. And the dispatcher himself didn't call O'Neill to tell him about it either. Not that the trains could be realistically moved at all. Back in the Seattle Express, passenger John Rogers saw the same avalanche the dispatcher saw earlier. He was a real estate man from Seattle, and it was enough for him to want to leave. On Sunday night, he heard shaking trees, and everyone was aware of a snow cornice hanging on the cliff above. It wasn't over the train, but with everyone able to see all of the avalanches in the distance, nowhere in Wellington felt safe. Rogers decided to follow the idea of Jessup and Merritt and hike to Scenic the next day. Some other passengers wanted to join him, but were unable to. The guy he came with, 59-year-old Ms. McNenny, former judge and an attorney in Seattle, refused to join him. Around 9 p.m., the telephone lines went down again, and by midnight, Conductor Pettit announced that he would join them on the journey to Scenic. He wanted to oversee the relief supply, since they were running low on just about everything on the train. He also wanted to see how the conditions were on the chance that they needed to evacuate, but he told everyone that he would still come back the same day, so they wouldn't be alone that night. A passenger named R.M. Laville, who was an electrician from Montana, approached Pettit that night, and they went outside to talk. Laville pointed to a break in the snow about 30 feet up from the train. Pettit assured him that it was probably fine there, but that it was a good example of what to look out for on the journey to Scenic. While Laville appeared worried about the break in snow, for some reason he didn't join the group going to Scenic in the morning. He stayed on the train. Sunday night, the passengers could hear multiple avalanches going off as they slept. On the morning of Monday, February 28th, the snow cornice hanging high up looked ready to snap. Rogers started second-guessing the plan to go to Scenic, knowing that an avalanche could hit them no matter where they were. It could hit them in the train or on the hike down the mountain. He could see how much safer workers felt on the train, considering they were choosing to sleep there instead of in their living quarters to the east. But seeing how determined Pettit was pushed him to join the Scenic expedition. Before they left, Libby Latch gave Rogers a note to send once he made it. It told the manager of her accessories business not to expect her for a few more days. And of course, by the time it made it to its destination, it wouldn't matter anymore. Rogers put the note in his pocket, and at noon, several of the younger passengers, crew members, and Pettit joined him in leaving the Seattle Express. Once they started walking, they ran into a railroad worker from Ontario. His name was Edward Bowles, and he was burning off energy in the Wellington yard. He came with his brother Albert on the Seattle Express, and he decided to join the group for a little bit on the journey to Scenic. He planned to turn back once he got a feel of the terrain. On their way, the weather was bad enough that Roger could only see out of his right eye. But the group moved quickly because Pettit was breaking ground. Some of the people in the group regretted starting the journey, but after reaching a certain point, it was just easier to keep going than to turn back. Once it was time for them to slide down the steep slope, someone hit a rock on the way down, At first, everyone thought the person was dead, but the hit wasn't actually that serious. And the second they all hit the bottom, they sprinted to Scenic Hot Springs Hotel to get away from all of the boulders and everything else that was falling behind them. It only took them an hour and a half to complete the journey because of the warming weather clearing the trails a little bit. Rogers and Pettit believed that the conditions were good enough that the able-bodied men could make their way down and help with anyone else who needed assistance. So Pettit went to send a message to Wellington Station, saying as much, but just before the message to tell everyone to start coming down the trails was sent, the telephone lines went down again. Pettit stayed at Scenic for a bit longer to arrange the supplies. He could have just taken a short train ride home to be with his wife and children, but because he told the passengers he would come back for them the same day, that's what he did. At first, Rogers was going to join him in returning to the train, but decided against it a little into the hike. Rogers wished Pettit good luck, and he went on his way. Now, with O'Neill, Monday wasn't as productive. He finally had coal and the X808 in operation, but because of the slides falling behind the plow, he hadn't been able to take it back to Scenic for water. It wasn't a huge deal. They were surrounded by snow after all, so the men told him that they would just shovel snow into the rotary and use the steam hose to melt it, which worked at first. But with the debris in the snow, it eventually clogged the engine's injectors. So they had to stop to clean it, and during that time, about 2 feet of snow fell. O'Neill at this point was so beyond over the storm because he had to take over this rotary to relieve the conductor and crew that had been working on it for 96 hours straight. Luckily, the rotary from the division to the east of them was on the way, along with the engineers from the fast mail. O'Neill also had major reinforcements to look forward to. The day before, he sent an SOS to company headquarters and was told that the manager for the entire Great Northern Railway was already on the way with some of the highest operations officers in the country. On the Seattle Express, those still inside tried to keep their spirits up, but everyone had grown irritable, and it didn't help that the lack of clean accommodations was starting to affect the smell in the train. They tried to melt the snow to handle things like that, but considering the workers used the restroom in those areas, it was a turnoff. There was also a spring in town residents used for drinking water, but no one bothered to tell the passengers about it. Spirits lifted when Pettit came back and told everyone the trail was passable. It was too late to walk him back that day, but more passengers agreed to leave with him in the morning. Some of the passengers went to the Baylitz Hotel and bought clothing to prepare for the hike. While most passengers were optimistic and willing to do the journey now, Henry White was incredibly upset that this was the best option presented to them. He didn't want to have to consider all the work that would go into helping the passengers that couldn't walk themselves. Like Sarah Covington, who hadn't been off the train since it stopped, or J.R. Vale, who had a nurse and was now in life-threatening condition. And while Pettit believed that the train would be safer by the tunnel at this point, he didn't want to go against his superiors. There also wasn't enough manpower at Wellington to clear the snow for him to move the train back, so there just wasn't much he could do. So White and the others made a petition addressed for O'Neill and dated the 28th. It said, quote, "Dear Sir, we the undersigned passengers on train number 25, after waiting here 6 days and believing it will be impossible to move the train for many days, request that you meet us here on the train tonight to the end that some means may be found that passengers can make their way over to Stockholmish or to some point this side of there, where they may take the trains to their respective destinations." End quote. Bert Matthews, a traveling salesman from Ohio, took the letter to O'Neill's business car and typed it on the typewriter with Longcoy overseeing him. It was brought back to the Seattle Express, where 34 of the remaining passengers signed it and gave the copy to former Judge McNenny. The original was sent to O'Neill, and O'Neill contacted Blackburn to see what they wanted, and Blackburn sent Longcoy to meet the passengers. They weren't happy about it, but stated their demands nonetheless. They wanted the railroad to send them 50 men, one per passenger, to help people go over the trail using whatever equipment was necessary. Longcoy debunked that demand immediately because there were only 7 men on the payroll at Wellington Station. The passengers let him know that they were aware of the 100-plus men that arrived in Scenic to help. So Longcoy told them it wasn't happening, and they told him to put his refusal in writing. So of course he told them he wouldn't do that because he doesn't actually have a say, and the passengers got on him because that was exactly their point. They wanted someone who can make decisions to speak to them. So Longcoy got Blackburn. Blackburn was immediately flabbergasted at the able-bodied men in the group demanding that he reallocate the men that had shown up to help relieve other issues on the mountain to help them. So then the men suggested that he at least send enough to help the women and children still on the train. But Blackburn wouldn't do it. And Blackburn doubled down, saying that if he saw any of the men trying to take the women off the train, he would stop them, because they could hurt themselves trying to get down the mountain, but they weren't going to wipe the women out with him when they died. When Blackburn left that night, he had agreed to provide a couple of men to guide the able-bodied men who wanted to leave in the morning down the mountain. He also looked into taking care of the train sanitation problems and getting fresh water for those unable to leave. That night, everyone's spirits were lifted, and they threw a party. Libby Latch and Nellie Sharp were going around gathering men's clothes for the trip because they decided they were leaving the train regardless of Blackburn's ban. As everyone got ready for bed around 10:30 p.m., everyone was in high spirits. Well, everyone except Archie McDonald, a brakeman. Before going to sleep, he turned to his friend and said something along the lines of, "We're all happy now, but we may be crying before the morning." At the same time, James O'Neill was getting ready for bed himself, after being relieved from his position at the plow by a mechanic. It was his second night of more than 1 hour of sleep, and he couldn't help but think of his wife and child back home. He sent her telegrams whenever he got the chance, but he missed her a lot and knew she was hoping to hear of when he would be coming home. But he couldn't return home until the work on the mountain was done. On Tuesday, March 1st, at 1:42 a.m., Henry White and Bert Matthews were finishing packing for their trip to Scenic in the morning. White decided he would go with them after talking to Pettit about the trip a few hours earlier. Everyone else in the Seattle Express was asleep. In the fast mail train, the men heard about the hike to Scenic in the morning from Blackburn, and they decided they would join. So they locked up the first class and registered mail and secured things following procedure before creating a makeshift bed that they had been sleeping on the past few days. They piled empty mail sacks on pallets in the second-class mail car. That night, in the third-class mail car, several workers and conductors were playing a loud card game. One of the crew left around 1 a.m. and hiked to Scenic in the rain. Everyone else decided to sleep there for the night. They all knew they needed to rest while they could, because they had been spending the last 2 days chopping wood to keep the double rotary plow's engine going. Once the X808 arrived, they knew they would have their work cut out for them trying to get the mail out. At Wellington Station, the second shift telegraph operator had nothing to do with communication lines being down, so he went home early, around 10 p.m., and he told his wife how he was uncomfortable with the growing amount of snow that was accumulating near them. Their cabin was at the east end of town, above a creek, and in a slide-prone area. After talking it over, they decided they would stay as long as the snow on their roof stayed. If it slid off at all, they would leave and go to the tunnel. But without the regular runs of trains, there were no regular noises to keep them somewhat alert of conditions overnight. And it wasn't until a freak thunderstorm started above Stevens Pass that a few light sleepers woke up. Electrical storms in the mountains in the winter was completely unheard of. None of the Wellington residents could recall a time where it had ever happened prior to this. Alfred Hensel, being one of the light sleepers, moved himself over to the other end of the car away from the other mail clerks. He was having a hard time sleeping before the storm due to the pallet feeling too hard, so he moved himself between two mail crates on the opposite wall. East of the station, others woke to see lightning going across the sky and thundering loud enough to shake windows. Most just went back to sleep, but engineer Charles Andrew was someone who was wide awake when he noticed the weather. His shack was near the bottom of a narrow gully and knew a snowslide was a definite possibility. Andrews was exhausted, but he threw on his clothes and went out into the rain to try and wake everyone in the nearby shacks. He yelled and shook them, but they just told him to go back to bed. So he went to the bunkhouse near the tunnel and started a fire to try and keep warm. He could see the tail end of the train with steam rising from it a bit away, but figured it would be too full for him to try and squeeze in with other workers already choosing to stay inside the train. After about 10 minutes, at 1:42 a.m., he heard thunder and the unmistakable sound of an avalanche. 1,000 feet above the trains, a long horizontal crack split the snow, causing a huge slab to tumble down the mountain. A member of the Wellington crew was in the hotel when he heard the sound and rushed outside. He saw what looked like the whole side of the mountain tear away. It was half a mile wide and moving slowly, but taking everything in its path. It just missed the hotel and depot, but it was headed straight for the two trains with 125 people inside. Some were awake, like Henry White, who immediately realized what was happening and instantly felt regret for being in the train and for the children that he was just playing with earlier being in it too. The feeling of falling was hard to describe, but the feeling of the train car splitting like an eggshell when it struck the bottom was a distinct feeling everyone remembered. The fast mail train fell harder. The people inside were in the air before they were even awake. They were tossed around like pebbles before falling into the valley below. Some victims felt like the fall took 20 minutes. Others felt like it took 2 seconds. But as each car fell, it brought more and more snow with it, and the weight laid on everyone below. The immediate silence, rather than wailing or crying, let those who were conscious know immediately that the death toll was huge. One person from the fast mail car said it was an awful death to die while surrounded by darkness. Slowly, people from the fast mail started coming to and thrashing and suffocating under the snow. The mail clerks ran around digging out their fellow survivors, and one by one, they heard them crying out. Most of the survivors from that train were in the third-class mail car. The second-class mail car split in half at the side doors while the train fell. The part that split and fell deep was the section Hensel moved away from. If he hadn't moved, he would have been killed instantly like the others. As it was, the side he moved to landed on the side with the rotary landing on top of it, just inches away from his chest. The crates he moved earlier protected him, but he was suffering from broken ribs and a broken collarbone. Hensel began going into shock, and he kicked himself feet first out of the wreck. Freeing himself, he realized he left his wallet, watch, and keys in the wreck, so he went back to get it. The last thing he remembered before passing out were the lights of Wellington high above him and lanterns walking towards him. Survivors of the Seattle Express were in different stages of shock, wandering around the bottom of the canyon with half of their clothes missing. Henry White walked out onto the snow and saw Porter Lucius Anderson laying down. He went to grab a blanket and offered it to Anderson, but Anderson was so disoriented he refused, telling him that he would just turn on the steam in the car instead. As more survivors surfaced and waited for rescue, the only thing indicating anything happened below for rescuers was a piece or two of barely visible pieces of the train. On their way to help, some of them ran into a man and woman buried under the snow up to their necks. They were alive, so the men tried to dig them out by hand since they didn't have time to think to grab shovels before running down. The snow was too hard to dig by hand, so they rushed back to get tools to dig. Unfortunately, by the time they made it back, both people were dead. As Wellington townspeople rushed to help, they did their best to help people trapped under the train and in the snow. People were dying as they were trying to free them. Some of the ones that were freed were killed when more avalanches came down. The town's oldest resident, the hotel owner, did what he could to help, but even he didn't realize the scale of what happened until he went out to where the trains were supposed to be and realized they weren't just derailed, they were gone, and so were the tracks. In the process of trying to help a severely injured 7-year-old, he was nearly wiped out by sliding snow himself. So he took himself back to bed after realizing that it was best to leave this to the younger men. Wellington residents moved east of town where they felt safer and brainstormed ideas on how to let O'Neill know what just happened. They needed him to send rescue supplies, medics, and all the help they could get. But the lines were still down, so someone had to go on foot. The avalanches going off all over the place made the task a dangerous one. An engineer was sent down the mountain, but they knew it would be hours before help arrived still. Trainmaster Blackburn and Harrington were nowhere to be found, so those there had to make a plan on what to do. The bunkhouse was turned into a temporary hospital, and someone went over to Baylett's hotel for linens, clothing, razors, and other things that could be used as supplies. Apparently, the owner refused to allow them to use anything without paying for it, and allegedly there was a gun pulled, but after some persuading, he relented. The injured 7-year-old from before, Raymond Starrett, had a 2-foot piece of wood sticking out of his forehead. No one there was actually a trained doctor, but they did their best to help him. The wood was removed, and although Ray was delirious, he would go on to recover. A while later, William Harrington eventually showed up. He had a serious head wound, injured foot, and was wearing a bloody nightgown. After that, Homer Purcell came in with a broken arm and other injuries. Realizing they would need more help fast, another person was sent down to Scenic. They wanted to be sure their message got through in case something happened to the first person they sent. Reports of what rescuers were finding in the wreck was awful. Severed and burned body parts, and the worst was the discovery of the top half of 3-year-old Thelma Davis. Somehow, the entire Gray family survived, including their 18-month-old Varden, despite his very severe injuries. Avalanches usually kill people by throwing them into debris in their path or by suffocation, whether that's from the weight of the snow on them or their breath melting and refreezing the snow around their mouth into an ice mask. When being trapped under the snow, the survival window is usually 15 minutes. But in this case, some of the air pockets people were trapped in were bigger, which gave them a chance to survive longer. So people were found alive hours after being buried. The last person rescued from the train alive was Ida Starrett. She woke up to the sound of the avalanche and was fully aware during the fall into the canyon. When they hit the bottom, she was knocked out. When she came to, she could feel something painfully pinning her back and keeping her from moving anything more than just her fingers. She noticed baby Francis under her stomach, still alive and breathing, when she thought about her children and parents. She was unable to move her arms to try and help baby Francis, so she just had to sit and listen to him take his last breaths while she went in and out of consciousness. Eventually, she came to again and heard rescuers nearby, so she started shouting. At first, the rescuers thought it sounded like meowing, but they eventually realized it was her calling for help. After some confusion, they finally found her pinned under a tree trunk, so they got some tools and started working to free her while she was in shock. Back in Scenic, James O'Neill woke up early to check on the rotary before getting a relief group together to go check on the trains. It wasn't until 8 a.m., 6 hours after the avalanche, that the first man sent to deliver the news made it to Scenic. When O'Neill heard what happened, he immediately started giving orders. As the only one on the mountain with the key for secure communication with headquarters and the authority to order rescue services, order special relief trains, and all that stuff, he had to go on foot to find the closest location with a working telegraph, since Scenics was down. O'Neill put his second in command and the men sent down from Wellington in charge of mobilizing the men at Scenic and getting them to the passengers in need of help. Then O'Neill went to a small station 9 miles east of Skycomish. It had a working telegraph inside, and he sent out a message that was dated for March 1st. And it said, quote, "At 4 a.m., a large snow slide extending a half-mile in length came down at Wellington, extending from snowshed number 2, west of Wellington, to east, passing track switch, taking down water tank number 25 and 27's train car, A16, 4-motor shed, rotary X807, engine 702, 1032, and 1418. All passengers, number 25 train, more or less injured. Cannot say to what extent until we can get them out." End quote. The message was then switched to code and sent to the Great Northern higher-ups countrywide. The message itself relayed something unprecedented. For the first time in the 80-year history of railways, an avalanche had knocked off not one, but 2 trains in a disaster that to this day is the worst avalanche disaster in American history. When O'Neill finally made it to the crash site, the first thing that caught his eye was the 10-acre slab of snow missing from the side of the mountain, the broken trees, missing houses, and multiple trains broken in the valley below. By the afternoon of March 3rd, 29 bodies had been recovered. 24 were being treated, and 60 men were still searching through the snow for others. They estimated up to 30 people's remains still needed to be found. On Thursday, more people had been found, including James McNenny, the friend of Rogers that didn't want to leave with him on Monday. Both of the Lemons were killed. The 16-year-old daughter that Ada was worried about was taken in with her grandparents further away. A 26-year-old Nellie Sharp, who was newly divorced and working on a travel article as a freelance writer, was found with a diamond ring and $100 cash in her pocket. Most of the able-bodied survivors were sent out with doctors in the first 3 days after the avalanche. With Henry White so eager to leave, he told a reporter he would rather risk dying on the trail leaving Wellington than to stay there any longer. At some point, friends and family of the deceased came to Wellington. Catherine Fisher came to find the remains of her fiancé, a firefighter with the name Earl Fisher. A fellow reverend came to claim Reverend James Thompson, and Edward Bowles came back to claim his brother Albert. Even though he originally was going to turn back when hiking down to Scenic with Rogers and Pettit, the trip was so quick that he decided to go the whole way. Sarah Covington's 2 sons came hoping to find her alive in the hospital, but unfortunately, she wasn't found until the day of her 51st wedding anniversary. By the end of the week, people were still missing, including Edward Toppin. People were found as deep as 40 feet, and when they were found, they had to be piled up and taken to the makeshift morgue in Wellington Station baggage room to be identified. Because most people were in their night clothing, no one had identification papers on their person. So identification was more difficult, especially for those who had more severe injuries. The remains would be wrapped up in blankets and tied to Alaskan sleds with 4 men pulling it using ropes, 2 in front and 2 behind. From there, the remains would be tied by their feet to a rope One end of the rope was tied to the tree at the top of the slope, and the other was tied to a tree at the bottom. They were carefully sent down head first and held until they could be placed onto a train from scenic to the coast. O'Neill at first was being praised for his efforts, his nonstop work ethic, and his empathy for everyone the entire time. Personally, he was struggling with what happened. His business car, the A16, didn't fall into the valley, but the top was cut off and snow packed inside, with his steward, Lewis Walker, train master Arthur Blackburn, and Earl Longcoy suffocated inside. They were his friends, and they were dead, but it was made even worse when conductor Joseph Pettit was found. O'Neill knew his wife and 5 children would struggle without the income, and knowing he could have been clear of the train if he just stayed in scenic that night made it worse. At some point, rumors went around that foreign workers were looting remains, so O'Neill sent them to work elsewhere in the division. Apparently, only one man was found to have taken a gold watch from a victim, so the xenophobia from the media was blown completely out of proportion and uncalled for. And then on Friday, another blizzard hit, which resulted in unidentified remains being found in a creek somewhere, 3 telegraphers being trapped in a station without food, the recovery efforts stopped, and an avalanche hit a small cabin with a watchman inside, killing him. Mentally, everyone was shaken, from survivors to rescuers and everyone in between. And then, one night, the snow on the roof of the Baylitz Hotel slid off. The sound was loud enough to wake up everyone in town, and it scared the owner so much that he took his family to stay in a train car on the spur tracks to the east of Wellington. And every night, recovery workers would walk 3 miles to stay the night at Cascade Tunnel Station. With O'Neill and the Great Northern chairman not speaking directly to the press, and any higher-ups only briefly commenting on the positives of the situation, the press got pretty imaginative. They started concocting stories about people miraculously waking up and being moved off the train just before an avalanche took it out. There were stories about a little baby surviving, even though both parents didn't, wild animals roaming and ravaging the crash site, and stranded workers being forced to kill a cat for food. Apparently, there was even a story about how they somehow stumbled upon a train car days after the accident, and when they opened it up, they saw 10 people alive inside. And as crazy as that story was, that was the one that went international. The Great Northern were staying quiet because they didn't know the true death toll, but they did know that on the day of the avalanche, at least 85 people were killed. The problem was they were hoping and praying that the death toll stayed under 116, because that was the amount of people who died in a train accident in 1904 in Colorado. If they went over that number, the Great Northern would be branded as having the worst train accident in American history. And while the Wellington Avalanche was a huge disaster for the Great Northern as a company, for headquarters in St. Paul, it was not the biggest problem they were facing. Because since the lines had started backing up on February 23rd, every hour that passed cost the company money. Even now, the lines were still backed up, with slides all over the place, and they were struggling to reroute traffic. They sent 200 men to help the hundreds already working in the division, 10 coal cars, a car full of dynamite, and more, and were still struggling to clear the tracks. Not to mention, on March 6th, a huge slide over 100 feet deep fell onto the tracks. It took over 4 days to clear it, even with dynamite. 19-year-old Bill Morris was part of the recovery teams looking for remains that would last the next 5 months. He remembered how, on March 6th and 7th, when the fast mail cars were finally dug up, all 8 of Alfred Hensel's coworkers were inside. He was the only survivor of that train car. Eventually, Edward Toppin was found with an unfinished note next to him. By the 10th, 9 survivors in serious condition were still at the makeshift hospital until the train could get through to them. Ida Starrett, who lost her baby, and another child, but still had 7-year-old Raymond with the head injury, and her mom, totally gave up her will to keep going on when she found out her dad didn't make it. Her story was big in the press due to her mental state. Raymond, who was so excited to see Basil Sherlock, the man who removed the wood from his head and took over as a doctor after the accident, Sherlock, however, was so traumatized he didn't have much to say to Raymond, and he quit his job as a telegrapher a day or 2 after the accident. O'Neill rejected his attempt to quit, so Sherlock agreed to stay on until things wrapped up, because while most workers were traumatized, for the most part they took it in stride, and they weren't willing to throw their careers away. They knew what they signed up for. 16 days after the avalanche, the trains were able to go through Wellington again, and even though all 9 of the more serious condition survivors were scared to get on the train, They all agreed to go east. And then 2 days after that, on Saturday, they were finally able to get the lines west of the area cleared. Things were able to get moving again, but just after midnight on Sunday, a train named the Oriental Limited was going westbound approaching Windy Point. The snow started back heavy again and caused a train car to slide off the tracks a little. They got back on the tracks and moved the train backwards to a snow shed while they waited for a rotary plow to move the snow. The plow had a pusher engine and 5 cars of coal attached to it. They were almost done clearing the tracks when an avalanche started falling in their direction. The 20 workers outside moving snow in front of the rotary ran when they saw it coming, but the plow wasn't able to reverse fast enough and was hit by the avalanche. Everyone except for an engineer and laborer were able to get out of the way in time. The engineer survived the fall the plow made onto the bridge below, but the laborer didn't, and he actually wasn't found until several weeks later. And because James O'Neill wasn't gonna let history repeat itself, especially so soon after this happened, he got approval and then quickly had everyone taken off the train and had the train sent back to Spokane. The passengers were led on foot to Scenic. On March 15th, O'Neill was finally able to go home to his wife Bernice and their baby after it was determined that the tracks were safe and clear. He still needed to reach out to the families of his steward, Lewis Walker, and telegrapher Earl Longcoy and deliver the news while also paying his respects. He also had to cooperate with the investigation into the disaster. Surviving passengers had started speaking to the press and refuting the claims that O'Neill did his best to help them. From their point of view, he didn't do enough considering they had been asking him to move them for days leading up to the avalanche. Other hit pieces were published against the Great Northern for allowing wildfires to burn unchecked on the mountainside. Had they handled the fires and saved the trees and vegetation in the area, there would have been no avalanche to begin with. The trees would have held the snow in place. There were also criticisms about the lack of snow sheds between Wellington and Scenic, especially considering they had known avalanches have gotten close to hitting moving passenger trains in the area before. That all escalated to articles about the questionable labor practices the Great Northern had, and how they hired the cheapest foreign labor possible. Things got worse when it was revealed that the Great Northern had most of their crew working on clearing the tracks instead of recovering bodies after the accident. And those who were supposed to be recovering bodies were told to focus on belongings and things that could be of use to the company. Families had to hire help for their own relatives' recovery. And ultimately, opinions focused on the fact that the entire thing could have been avoided had the company settled the switchmen's worker strike back in November. If it had been settled, there wouldn't have been a coal shortage, a lack of help, and just overall chaos in the mountain. The protest became loud enough that the coroner decided there would be an inquest into the accident. But he wanted to wait until everyone had been identified and recovered, which took time. But there were people still missing, and there were lots of cases of mistaken identity. In one instance, like 20 people identified one victim as being a specific person. Lo and behold, the guy shows up perfectly fine and not dead at all. He actually missed the train and was off in the wilderness somewhere, nowhere near the accident. The last body wouldn't be found until the end of July, 21 weeks after the avalanche. Bill Morris found his friend and fellow brakeman, 23-year-old Archibald McDonald, the guy who mentioned there may be tears before morning. He was found in the creek at the bottom of the mountain, trapped under splintered timber, and likely only discovered because of the late thaw. In the end, 96 people died, with about 2/3 of them being employees of the Great Northern Railways. 35 of those were passengers, and 61 were trainmen and employees. 3 of them were inside of buildings, and 6 were unidentified. In total, 35 people survived, 8 of which were passengers in the train, 13 of which were passengers and crew who walked to Scenic prior to the avalanche, and 13 of which were train employees that survived the avalanche. The Great Northern's legal team was obviously scrambling to cover their tracks from the jump, doing whatever they could to make sure they wouldn't be found liable for any reason. They had higher-ups raiding offices, removing paperwork, everything. They contacted families of deceased employees and offered $1,000 for dependents of married men and $500 for dependents of unmarried men, but they had to sign away their right to sue. For Conductor Pettit's family, $1,000 wasn't enough, so she requested $2,500. She had 5 kids. The company was sympathetic to her, but they knew if they gave her more, others would expect the same, so she was denied. And allegedly, mail clerks and day laborers were offered far less, if anything at all. Now, it's my understanding that coroner inquest verdicts are not binding, and they don't mandate or prevent legal action, but they very easily opened the window to it. So when the inquest started, Henry White was at the forefront of the complaints against the company and O'Neill. He was the only surviving passenger, part of the group of people that wanted to be moved away from the ledge. And it didn't help that when he called the Great Northern after the accident to see about compensation for all of the belongings he lost, they referred him to their legal department and told him he wouldn't see a penny. At the beginning of the hearing, James O'Neill came across as owning up to his responsibility and not allowing any blame to be placed on Conductor Pettit. He answered everything plainly and matter of fact, and he even explained the reasoning behind his decisions. While White and another passenger were obviously hostile towards the Great Northern and O'Neill, most of the other passengers that survived or left the train early commended the company and O'Neill for their effort. John Merritt took the stand and backed O'Neill, saying he'd never met someone so nice and clearly wanting to do everything he could to help them. An employee took the stand and told everyone how O'Neill followed standard operating procedure to the letter, and no other decision could have changed what happened. After a few days, the jury was taken out to the site of the Wellington Avalanche, and they met with Wellington residents. O'Neill walked them through everything that happened in the area, and when the owner of Baylett's Hotel spoke to the jury, he told them that he told the passengers to make a fuss so they could be moved to the spur tracks. O'Neill then tried to explain that during the time of the storm, there were 6 cars already on the tracks, not to mention all of the snow, and how it just wasn't feasible to move the train there. But of course, by this time, there was no snow on the tracks for the jury to even try and wrap their head around the conditions during the time. O'Neill went on to explain the amount of manpower that would have been needed to do that task, how workers were so confident in where the trains were placed that even the crew chose to sleep on the trains rather than in their sheds. Over the next few days during the hearing, White was put back on the stand and tore into every decision O'Neill made. He talked about how they desperately tried to meet with O'Neill, but he was too sleepy to bother speaking to them, and how his sleepy spell caused them all to be tossed off a mountain. Sarah Covington's daughter read some of her journal entries that mentioned no one knowing anything about when they would move and how people were scared of slides. After that, several officials from other railroad companies testified saying that O'Neill made the right decision, and they themselves wouldn't have done anything different to what he did. While the jury deliberated, O'Neill and the Great Northern weren't sure what they would decide. There wasn't really any evidence pointing to O'Neill actually doing anything wrong per se, but they could tell the jury wanted someone to blame. And even though the county coroner looked into the avalanche at the beanery and the one that happened with the watchman and found the company not liable, no one knew what to expect. The jury came back with the findings that the deaths that happened with the Seattle Express were out of human control, but they went on to say that the trains weren't placed in the safest spot to prevent an accident, since there were places to the east of where they were at where the trains could have been taken. But because the Great Northern lacked enough coal to handle these types of emergencies and only paid workers 15 cents an hour when they had to turn around and pay $4.50 every week for somewhere to sleep, it caused 35 workers to leave when they should have kept them regardless of their pay. Having enough workers was a basic necessity to ensure the safety of passengers on the Great Northern Railway line. All of these points felt like personal attacks to O'Neill, and to the company, it was a door left open for future lawsuits. And those lawsuits came a few years later. Some people settled out of court, some didn't want to deal with it at all, and others tried to go fight in court but couldn't afford it. Hensel, the only surviving mail clerk, still worked for the Great Northern and suffered from random paralysis, so he tried to sue for suffering with O'Neill over how their previous grievances went ignored. But Hensel was forced to settle out of court for a low amount. The Railroad Commission eventually found the Great Northern not liable and released the company's plans to gain the public trust again. They would replace the wooden shelters with concrete ones and build additional shelters totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars. The October following the accident, the station name Wellington was switched to Thai, leading customers to believe that the Great Northern didn't run through Wellington anymore. The switchmen's strike also ended. The only benefit they were able to gain was another 5 cents an hour, and they barely got that. It was kind of a low blow considering even for that requirement, they were hoping for 6 cents. By October 1913, Edward Toppin's father managed to get a hearing in court for his son, who was now 5 years old. The Great Northern decided to try this case first out of the hundreds that they were holding off the best they could. The idea was to test the water to see how the rest of the cases might go and felt this was their best shot at winning. Alfred Hensel was the first person called to the stand. He apparently previously mentioned to Toppin's lawyer that on the morning of February 23rd, a government official told Hensel that it was insane to try and cross the mountains that night on the fast mail. The opposing lawyer wanted Hensel to tell the story but the Great Northern's lawyers were able to have questions associated with that blocked. It was labeled as hearsay, and it had nothing to do with Toppin's train anyway. The opposing lawyer overall wasn't the type of guy I would say I'd want to represent me, just because he came across very hostile and not sympathetic like you would want someone arguing that an orphan boy deserves more money because of a company's actions. He also clearly didn't know much about trains or what the actual issues were. And it didn't help that this was 3 years after the accident, and the Great Northern had spent a truckload of money on fixing all 3 of the main points that they were found liable with in the inquest. Only 9 other witnesses were called to the stand, and Susan Baylitz from the hotel pointed out that the slope above the spur tracks was more slide-prone than the one above where the trains were, which made things worse. He didn't even ask Henry White more than a few vague questions. So, when things moved on to trying the actual case, the Great Northern was optimistic. O'Neill was called to the stand, and by this point he was 41 years old, with 2 children with his wife. He was promoted to Assistant General Superintendent to all Great Northern lines west of Montana. They went through O'Neill's working history and accident-free history prior to this, and his choices. Other workers gave similar testimony, and eventually Harrington took the stand. At first, he did well. He was labeled the Snow King, but eventually he started contradicting himself and forgetting testimony he gave just minutes before. The next day, when Harrington was called back to the stand, it was revealed he told Henry White, after the accident, that the train should have been placed somewhere safe. Harrington denied saying that, so they put White back on the stand, and he firmly stated that, "Yep, Wellington Harrington said that to me." And for that to be literally the only effective point that the opposing lawyer was able to make, it was shocking that the jury came back with a guilty verdict. Topping was awarded $20,000 of the $40,000 they originally asked for. The next year, Washington State Supreme Court accepted the Great Northern's appeal of the case and found them not guilty. They felt it was an act of God, and there wasn't enough evidence showing that the company contributed to the cause of the accident, rather than the actual avalanche being out of everyone's control. Toppin's family had to pay back the $20,000 with 6% interest and $250 on top of that for court fees. Corporations were obviously happy to hear this verdict, especially the Great Northern, who knew a guilty verdict would open the door to so many more lawsuits. Survivors and victims' families, who were happy with the guilty verdict, were hurt to hear it was reversed. And I can imagine the Toppin family were probably pretty bad off financially after that. James O'Neill felt relief that his efforts didn't seem like they were for nothing. But I do wonder if things would have been different if he wasn't so focused on getting that one rotary to work at Scenic in the days leading up to the avalanche. I mean, he was sleep deprived, and hindsight is 20/20, right? But everyone probably would have survived if he had realized that the hike down to Scenic wasn't so bad when Pettit came down, as it was when he came down prior to that. Although again, it would have gone against standard operating procedure. People looking at the transcripts to the court case following all of this agree that it was illogical for the jury to find them guilty in the first case, because there was no evidence that the company or its employees did anything to actually cause the deaths. But people were just tired of big business taking advantage of everyday people and getting away with it, especially as far as the railroad was concerned. In 1929, the Great Northern unveiled a $25 million tunnel that was well below the dangerous slide area after several more years of slide-related problems, and being tired of reconstructing the concrete snowsheds. In my opinion, this entire thing was a tragic, perfect storm. I personally can't imagine being 5'0" and shoveling snow easily 3 times taller than me. Granted, I'm a woman, so I wouldn't have been out there to begin with. Not to mention the time period, I definitely wouldn't have been out there. But to me, it's sad that the victims and survivors didn't receive compensation, and that the workers were the ones who were seen in a bad light. If anything, it should have all been put on the heads of the company who were ultimately pulling the strings that caused everything to happen the way it did, with the background culminating into the trains being stuck in that spot the very moment the most unprecedented disaster ever happened. Stay safe, and I'll be back next week. All sources can be found at occurrencepod.com, which is linked in the show notes, along with any other relevant information.